Okay, so this video is a little bit late, but we have finally hit 500 subscribers. I can't even begin to thank you guys enough for all the support you've shown me. I started this channel to just show other people my perspective when I play video games, but it's grown into far more than just that. It started to grow into a full community. You guys have shown me that my silly little hobby can actually make many people out there happy, and that it's not just me having fun anymore, it's all of us. Now, I'm not really someone who has a way with words, so before I start to ramble even more, I just want to say thank you. Now, before we get started, I want to give a massive shout out to my friend Banana Popsicle for the suggestion and for helping me with this project. As soon as I realized I was getting close to 500 subs, I asked her for her help and she recommended a handful of things, but this one really stuck. I would also like to give a shout out to Drone UK for his video that inspired Banana to recommend it to me. Now, without further ado, let's see how I made this. To get started, let's see all the things I used. To make this, I needed a shadow box. I went with 8x10, the 3D printed play button. I was able to ask my D&D buddy Matt to make this for me. Thanks, Matt. We got sandpaper and steel wool to smooth the rough edges, metallic spray paint to give the button a metallic shine to it. I also got some red paint for the button and white paint for the middle, but as we'll find out later, the red paint wasn't necessary. The first thing we need to do is sand down the print to make sure it's not filled with 3D printed grooves. I was going to use really fine sandpaper, but my stepdad recommended I use steel wool, so I figured I'd try that first. My buddy Matt also gave me a few extra 3D prints to test the paint on, but we'll get to them later. To make sure I don't ruin the print, I'll test the sandpaper on the steel wool on the back. Here, I'm taping the back, so I'll have one section for each sandpaper grit and the steel wool. My phone neglected to record some of this process, but we are now sanding each segment to test each of the grits. After seeing the results, it's now clear that the sandpaper and steel wool will not ruin the print, so I proceeded to sanding the whole thing. Starting at the lowest grit and working my way up to the highest grit, and then finally the steel wool. After the whole process is done, the back is as smooth as a baby's bottom. Let's move on. First, we'll start with the 220 grit paper. Then, move on to the 320 grit paper. Now that that's done, we'll move on to the 400 and 600 grit paper. So far, this is smoothing out perfectly. Now that all the sandpaper is done, time to move on to the steel wool. The steel wool process is the exact same as the other two. Just use a whole lot of elbow grease and smooth it out the best way possible. Now that the button is prepped for painting, let's go back to the test prints my buddy made for me. Here, we'll take the metallic silver spray paint and give it a nice even coating. But don't drop it like I did. Oops. Once there's an even coat on it, I'll let it dry for about half an hour. Then I'll apply another coat. Once again, I'm applying an even coat over the whole thing, and then I'll let it sit for another 30 minutes. Now that it's been drying for a bit, we'll add the last coat to it and we'll leave it overnight to fully cure. While we wait for the test mini to cure, we'll sand down the middle of the play button. This time, we have to be a bit more careful since this one is way thinner. Once it's fully sanded, I'll make sure it fits snugly into the button, which it does. So now I lay down some tape to protect the inner portion of the button from the painting process and carefully cut out the excess. Now that our test print has been sitting overnight, it's time to test out our paint. We start by giving the print a nice coating of paint and we'll let it dry for another half hour or so. Now that the print is dry, let's paint all the parts we missed and touch up the others. Oh, and a surprise visit from my mom. Say hi, Mom! Once the print is fully painted, we'll let it dry overnight once again. Our test print is now fully dry, so let's take it back out to the garage and spray it with some clear spray paint I had laying around. As we did with the silver spray painting, we'll give it a nice even coating again and leave it to fully cure overnight. Alright, so our test print seems like it's all good to go, so it's officially time to start painting the play button. Once again, as we did with the test print, we'll give this one a nice even coat of silver paint and we'll let it sit for an hour this time, since it's so much extra paint. After letting it dry for a while, we can give it another coating. This coating seems to have done a good enough trick, so we'll let it sit overnight and get painting tomorrow. After letting it sit overnight, this thing is starting to look amazing. But we still need to paint it red. To give myself a bit more stability so I can paint the edges, I put it on top of my 3D print tube, then pick it back up again. And just when I think I'm finished, I see why I shouldn't have picked it back up again. Oops. Well, guess I gotta repaint it now. Now that I'm done painting it, I'll set it aside to dry while I paint the white part of the play button. This part will be way easier since it's such a small piece and it's such a simple color. I'll just squirt a dollop on here and give it a nice smoothing. Now that we're done with both of these parts, I'll let them dry overnight again. After leaving it sit overnight, I realized why this paint is good for small scale prints and not large scale ones. The paint on this scale looks horrible. But the white paint on the other hand looks great. I think just one more coat and it'll be good to go. Now, because the red paint looks so bad, we'll be going back to square one and we'll sand it off and repaint it silver. But this time, I got a surprise up my sleeve. Now that the button is resanded, it's ready for painting again. But I won't torture you with that whole process again. The button has now been repainted and it's had plenty of time to cure. But this time we'll be going with a red spray paint to give it a more even look. I'm using this red spray paint I got on Amazon for about $6. This is already looking so much better. Now, this time, I let it sit for 2 days so it can fully cure, as the next step was a bit tricky. For this next step, I stuck the button onto a little wooden block to make it easier to paint, as I've needed to resand and repaint this button several times now because I was too hasty and didn't give enough time to cure. And the clear spray paint I used caused some imperfections when it wasn't dry. So I let the button sit and cure for plenty of time, and it was finally time for the glossy coat. I've now let this sit overnight again to cure, and I added the next and final glossy coat to the print. While the button is curing, I did the same to the middle piece, attached it to a wooden block, and now it's time to cover it with gloss. For this one, it seemed like one coat was enough. Now that I've let both pieces sit overnight to cure, it's finally time to attach them to each other. For this, I just broke out my hot glue gun, put a little squirt in the middle, and carefully placed the two parts together. Now, it's time to get it in the frame. Before we get it in the frame, let's get the background all sorted out. Banane made this beautiful recreation of the old style YouTube play button plaques to help me out with this project. I printed it out on some glossy photo paper to make sure it kept its stunning appearance. To make sure it fits in the frame, I'll have to cut it down to size though, so I borrowed my mom's paper cutter to trim the edges a little bit. Once all the edges are trimmed, I make sure all the edges are as straight as possible. Now that we got that part figured out, we're going to want to put the button on the paper somehow. Luckily, my parents had some double-sided tape I could use. I make sure to carefully cut the excess off, and it seems good to go. So, I carefully place it as close to the middle as I can get. Now that the button and the background portion is done, I remove the stuff that was inside the back of the shadow box and put everything together. And it's finally done. So that is how I was able to make this homemade 500 subscriber plaque. I couldn't have done this without Banane's help or suggestion, so once again, massive shout out to her and Drone UK. Now, like I said in the intro, I don't really have a way with words, so I'll just leave you guys today with thank you all for everything. And here's to another 500 subs.